Time you're at the computer, get on the internet, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia, in the search field for Wikipedia, I want you to type in Japanese Americans 1942, and you'll find out all about your precious fucking rights, okay? All right. You know about it. You know about it. Yeah. In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens and good-standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps. Just when these American citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away. And rights aren't rights if someone can take them away.
On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese forces and would ultimately start the American incursion into World War II, when Germany and Italy declared war on us just days later. In February of 1942, Japanese American citizens and, more overly, Asian nationals were marched into the Japanese internment camps located all across the western seaboard. These camps would persist until about 1946, when all members of the camps would be let out. It was a very odd thing for America to do this. For so long we had enshrined the values of liberty and freedom within our Constitution and never turning on our own people. And throughout the duration of the camps, there was a lot of debate, at least among political circles, as to whether or not the Japanese should even be interned in the first place. However, at the end of the day, FDR signed into action Executive Order 9066 and ultimately approved of the Japanese internment camps. And even after learning about the German internment camps and the German Holocaust, he continued to go forward with the operations. I like FDR. He's a good president, and his social programs did a lot to spur America forward. But in reality, we cannot address the fact that he did support the concentration and discrimination and prejudice of hundreds of thousands of Japanese and American citizens and Asian nationals, threw them into camps, stripped them of their rights, and treated them like garbage. And what's worse is America seems all too well to write this entirely out of our history. I live in Washington, and we still keep the understanding of these Japanese internment camps because we can still go out and find people who spent time in these camps to this day, although their numbers are dying off. And Washington is one of the few states that actually keeps its internment camp up and operational and informs people about it. In fact, as far as I can understand, Washington is probably the only state that actively teaches about the internment camps, even though we had some of the fewest camps on offer. It's rather fascinating to find out that the American concentration camps that we actively supported and were used by hundreds of thousands of people seems to go unnoticed in American history, all to the behest of making us feel that we're more superior to the Nazis who ran similar operations. In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the horrors of the American internment camps of Japanese and American nationals in response and in theme to the the recent rise in hate crimes against Asian nationals going on in America right now in 2021. So shortly after Pearl Harbor happens, there's a huge increase in violence against Asian Americans. At this time on the West Coast, most Asian Americans were continuing to stay in their isolated communities, which we talked about in my other video where we discussed how Asian people were systematically forced into smaller, more ghetto operations and isolated communities. After the Pearl Harbor, however, massive amounts of other citizens would march into these communities and basically perpetuate hundreds of crimes. Everything from property damage to murders, rapes, lynchings, all kinds of things in response to this. The American populace wasn't all that together specific about what constituted a Japanese citizen. There are reports out of violence against Chinese nationals, people that we were actively helping, Korean nationals, South Pacific Islanders. Pretty much anybody who looked quote-unquote Asian was perceived as a Japanese person. And of course, the racial sentiment Jap was used predominantly in newspapers. In fact, before these, it was very often for people to just simply refer to Asian nationals as Orientals or Japanese specifically. There was a very clear distinction because of America's history with Japan, but it was actually around this time that the slur Jap started becoming a big thing, or Nips. Reason being is that the Japanese word for Japanese people, Nippon, is shortened down to Nips. This is actually a really interesting case that Before then, it was seen as distasteful to use such slurs against Japanese people in American newspapers because they had a decent connection with us. And as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, all these words became commonplace. In fact, it was actually very seen as socially unacceptable to use a proper term because it gave them more credence over themselves. The decision was made in early 1942 to essentially move all the Asian nationals into isolation zones. This is to say, exclusion zones in and around large communities that they had. The presidential answer for this was essentially, if people were already staying in these communities, just move the communities farther out to curtail the problem. There was a lot of concerns about Japanese sleeper agents, and if you remove the sleeper agents from the large population en masse, it tends to make them harder to operate. Even though the fact that most of these people who were being thrown into these camps, of which about 120,000 people entered the camps in the initial first wave of reaction. This is when it's entirely run by the military. 80,000 of the some 200,000 people put into the Japanese internment camps were Niseis, or second generation. Of that 80,000, some of them were actually third generation Sanseis that were just listed as second generations for paperwork purposes, because it was seen through a lot of social understanding at the time and immigration paperwork that third-generation citizens, or people who have been here for 3 generations in a country, were essentially unofficial patriotized citizens, and therefore they had no connection to the main motherland at that point. Basically, by 3 generations, it was understood that people would just naturally assimilate to American culture. This, of course, had to be changed to allow for these people to be thrown into internment camps. The other thing was that of this 200,000 plus people in total, the remaining number, which is somewhere in the 60,000 mark, was known as Iseis, or first generation, or travelers, or what's known as dual citizenry. So, if you're familiar with the concepts in anime of isekai, the idea of a person being transported to a stranger in a strange land, essentially, that is where this actually comes from. Now, Iseis, along with this new immigration reformation, were listed as ineligible for patriotization. It's a really hard word to say, we don't use it anymore. Here's the reason why. American immigration used to be really, really loose, mainly because of the Irish immigration, all the Chinese nationals from the railroads. Pretty much anybody could come into America, minus the Mexicans and South Americans. And even them, they went across the border all the time. It was just kind of assumed that as long as they came in and worked and did their business, no one really cared. Immigration was a thing we kind of stood on, but we didn't really care about it. But there was 2 types of immigration. We had what was known as immigration and patriotization. It is a really hard word to say, I apologize. It was assumed that people who come to this country naturally will become immigrants. That's fine. But you can have citizen. You don't have the rights of a citizen, but we essentially won't hunt you down. Then there's a patriotized citizen. This is a person who essentially has papers that say they're an American citizen, they're officially accepted as an American national, and have access to our rights. We don't have this anymore, for better or for worse. I would say if the system kind of seems on the surface a really good idea that anybody can come in and then you can apply for papers later. American immigration is a long storied history that just gets consistently worse the more you read about it, and I might make a video on that later to tie into this, but for right now we're just gonna go with what that right now, just to keep things simple. But it is important to understand that all these 200 some odd thousand citizens put into these concentration camps were all U.S. citizens. They were protected by U.S. rights because a lot of them were born here. There was very few Japanese people that came over and were just visiting. A very small percentage that the nation's rights didn't apply to them. Their rights were completely disregarded, and they were thrown into concentration camps. And if you're wondering why I keep saying concentration camps, it's because in 1942, February, when these camps opened, that's what they were actually listed as, concentration camps, to control citizens. It wouldn't actually be until 1943 when we started referring to them as internment camps. And unfortunately, we would be referring to them as internment camps about 3 days after FDR would find out about the German Holocaust. In fact, actually, a lot of the reasons why these camps were even set up in the first place is because a lot of people were in tacit support of Hitler's concentration camps of communists and Jews during the 1939. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did know about the concentration camps in Germany in 1939 from his ambassador to Hitler's Germany, Henry H. Dodd. You can read about that in the book The Garden of Beasts. So what specifically were the operations of these facilities? Well, the facilities were originally run by the Army Corps of Engineers and a colonel pretty much operated as most prisoner of war camps did at the time. But before long, obviously with the demands of the war effort and with the demands from rising agitation among the American populace, there was a need to turn it over to a council. Basically, people were kind of concerned that these wartime concentration camps, essentially in their states and backyards, all across the Pacific Northwest, were going to kind of be an issue, and a lot of people didn't like that. There was still a lot of distrust for the U.S. military at this time and the initial start of the war, mainly because America kept losing quite frequently. We had a lot of death toll. So what happened was that the U.S. government turned it over to the Wartime Civil Control Administration, or the WCCA, or WACA, as the colloquial goes. WACA was a civilian organized operation. There was basically no political or military operation of the camps by 1943. The reason being is because it was a lot easier for people to pallet. It was easier for civilians to control the area because civilian people would know more about the areas, more about the demands, and it was also to limit the amount of things the government had to be considered for. Basically, if the government is running something, it has to be included in its logistics paperwork. This was strictly a logistics understanding. Unfortunately, as soon as the WACA took control of these camps, internment camps, as they were to officially be designated, they started doing some really illegal things that basically no one cared about because everybody was in on it. One of the main things was the WACA started giving out funds for people who turned in Japanese nationals. Now, the WACA officially deny any and all funding giving to people, or saying we never told them we would give them a finder's fee for turning these people in, but there's enough memoirs out there that people were, in fact, turning people in. And of course, when you offer people monetary incentive, suddenly the amount of people finding Japanese nationals goes up a lot. This leads to the WACA having to commit to the Wartime Relocation Association, which would be in charge of doing the immigration ancestry. So at the time, a lot of people were interested in ancestry around this time, the 1930s, 1940s, and a lot of the people were on the books. So they actually had to make a specialized group to go back there and track Japanese-American heritage to prove a lot of these nationals getting thrown in these camps were in fact Japanese nationals. Reason being, this is actually where FDR kind of steps back in. FDR kind of pretty much figured out pretty early on that people would be throwing in Chinese nationals, Korean nationals, Vietnamese nationals, pretty much anybody who looked vaguely Asian. As a result, he specified only if people could prove their ancestry to be Japanese would someone be thrown into the camp, and that was mostly to protect from lifelong sleeper cells. This was a pretty decent measure, but again, everybody will always find a reason, and there's a good chance that a lot of these people thrown into these camps were not truly Japanese nationals, but simply looked Japanese. Reason being, I state that is because in Washington, my home state, they specified that, quote, any Jap with, or any person with at least 1/16 Jap in their blood will be considered Japanese, and therefore will be filed into the internment camps. This might sound horrifying, but this is actually on the better end of things, because in places like Arizona and California, the two states that had massive amounts of Asian populations and therefore held most of these camps, stated that, quote, if there's a drop of Jap blood in them, they're Jap. No questions, no concerns, just toss them in. And that is from the San Diego Times newspaper, 1943. Direct quote. Now, all this was allowed under Executive Order 9066, which is still on the books. You can actually go check it out in the National Archives. It is there and signed by FDR. Pretty much any information leading to the capture and detainment of the WACA was paid for, although the Executive Order never called for it. Essentially, the head of the Wartime Civilian Control Administration listed, and I quote, it doesn't say we can't do it neither. Yeah, because that saying just is pretty much perpetually in American politics. It didn't say you can do that. It didn't say we can't do it. It's very petulant, but, you know, look at the times. Now, there was 10 of these centers for relocation. So there's a variety of camps, and we'll go into that in a moment. But basically, there was 10 major relocation centers. And the difference between a concentration camp and a relocation center was a relocation center was exclusively for export. This was to emigrate people out of America, to send them back to their national home countries. Now, these 10 were mostly listed in California, Arkansas, and Arizona. None of them are in Washington. These centers now have all been completely destroyed, but these are basically the centers that would be handling a lot of the immigration paperwork, proof of genealogy, and the number counting. As a result, those don't exist anymore, and their files are pretty much all but destroyed. I would also like to list a quote from one of the Times in Washington, and this is actually a newspaper I managed to dig up on microfiche in the state archives here in Seattle. This understanding of these concentration camps was actually the better option, because for a long time people in the Pacific Northwest have been wanting to just straight outright destroy the native populace. In fact, there was actually a lot of consideration in Seattle to just simply move them to an island in the middle of the Sound and just leave them there. But I want to list from a newspaper here in Washington from the Vegetable Growers Association, which has now been assimilated into the Agricultural Association of Washington. This is from their newspaper in 1942. Quote, "We are charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives on the Pacific coast or the brown man. We'd never miss 'em in 2 weeks because farmers can take over produce and everything the Japs grow, and we do not want them back when the war ends either." End quote. You'll notice this is another good sentiment. Japanese and Asian nationals really aren't white, or aren't brown. They're white, relatively speaking. I understand there's Caucasian and white other race, but the only ways you could really distinguish, you can distinguish Asian people from other white people, but a lot of Asian people are not darker skinned as they are with South Pacific Islanders or Indians or Filipinos. So I don't really know where that's coming in, but this is actually a racist sentiment that was very common in the Pacific Northwest at the time, and actually would expand into Germany, that Japanese people were kind of seen as the white people of Asia, basically because they agreed to be our puppet state in the South Pacific. And now that they turned on us, they had to be completely demonized. So there's a lot of racial propaganda in the 1940s that depicts Asian people as a darker skin tone than they actually are. This is also where the birth of the quote-unquote Asian stereotype being depicted as a yellow person or people with yellow skin have this, is that this is really where that big run comes through, and it's to distinguish the Asian caricatures, because obviously you can't make the Asian person white in a cartoon, but you can make them yellow, it's the same skin tone, and also the very obvious depiction of buck teeth, Fu Manchus, and squid eyes. That's where this heats up to increase the fervor people already had as a hatred of Asians. I'd also like to state that most Asian nationals in the Pacific Northwest weren't agricultural farmers. Certainly in Washington on Whidbey Island and into the eastern parts of Washington, there was probably some agricultural farmers who got grouped in there. But for the most part, most Asian communities were self-sufficient and existed near ports and operated in sales and produce and import goods. They didn't really do agricultural work. That would, of course, change when they get into the concentration camps. But another big thing, too, is that most Asian people actually owned a lot of land in and around their areas and their isolated communities, which a lot of people didn't like, because a lot of that land was used for agricultural purposes to make their own community self-sufficient. And, of course, coming out of the Great Depression, a lot of that was an issue, especially in California. So, now let's move on to some of the actual operations of the camps. Essentially, there was three main things that happened in these camps. You were either put into forced labor, where that was obviously mostly agricultural. You'd either be farming, mining operations for the war effort, or production hubs. Production being mostly textiles. They did not trust Japanese citizens near firearms for fear they would learn how to backwards engineer them. The common sentiment at the time was that Asian people were very good at reproducing things, but not very good at inventing things. Again, there's a lot of racist and historical context to that, because America basically kept giving them stuff and they kept having to reverse engineer it to suit their needs. As a result, that stereotype came about. But then people forget that Japan acted as an isolated nation for 300 years, and then America showed up and they had to jump about 300 years in development and tech in the span of 20. The other operations were the forced military service, which would happen at 3 facilities. This was mostly for translation and communication operations. This is actually where a lot of the really big problems crop up. See, Japanese radio communications were not just very easy spoken as we are doing right now. A lot of their orders and commands actually came through allegory and spoken word poetry, or in certain tones. And in this regard, it was speaking in code. And of course, if you didn't have the understanding of Japanese culture, you wouldn't understand this code. We would use this with the Navajo native peoples to form the code talkers, for fear of American communications being deciphered by the Japanese. What, of course, would then happen is the Americans would then take multiple Japanese people, they would sit them in a room, give them a piece of paper, and tell them to translate a message for the American military. Problem was, again, some of these people in these camps were not Asian, or at least not Japanese. In fact, there are actually several reports of Chinese national citizens being given Japanese documents in a Japanese language. I do believe it's hiragana, which is the higher form Japanese writing or Japanese language, and not being able to translate it. And of course, the military would not assume, hey, maybe this person just doesn't speak that layer of Japanese. They would instead assume, well, this person's obviously a spy who doesn't want to translate for us because he's a sleeper agent. Yeah, I wish I could say that was a very rare occurrence, but it happened quite frequently. The other thing, too, is that you're forcing people to translate messages. The other way they do this is they'd walk into a room and give the same message to 4 different people in 4 different rooms and ask them to translate it. And if the words were 1 or 2 letters off, or the message kind of got misconstrued and yours didn't match up, it was going to lead to severe punishments for you, including isolation, starvation, forced labor, lowered rations, or just simply beatings. Here's the problem, though. Japanese language is not only based on soliloquy and allegory, it's also context dependent. You can easily make the wrong statement if you don't have the right context. And this context not only changes with the actual discussion going on, it also changes with the language, because Japan at the time had 3 or 4 different languages they were using to operate with. This is incredibly difficult for a lot of people to translate that are Japanese. That does require a lot of contextual understanding and essentially reading into the writing. And some words just don't simply translate over to English well, and that's for all languages. So it's very easy for someone who maybe doesn't speak this higher form or wasn't coded into this strange military talk to make the wrong contextual assimilation, still produce the same concept of the language. They will attack here at this time, but because their translation didn't match up with somebody else specifically, you're going to get 2 different stories, and one person's going to get beaten. And the reason being is for this is very obvious, because again, not every Japanese person understands every concept. Put it this way, if you go down south, you can have a person feed you the same story as a person in the north, but because their colloquial accents, dialogue, slang, and terminology are totally different, you're going to get 2 different understandings of the story. You're going to get 2 different functions of that story, and you might not record the story in the same context. And that's just with English. Now imagine doing that with a language that in a different foreign country that doesn't directly translate and has 4 different layers, and literally half the comments in this communique are based on moral stories or fairy tales that you're literally using to help translate things. It's very, and of course, you obviously want to communicate the same things as somebody else, otherwise, again, you'll get beaten or punished. So there's really a catch-22, damned if you do, damned if you don't, for these poor people who probably, in the first case, just simply didn't know, or number 2, didn't even speak Japanese to begin with. Again, a lot of Chinese nationals got thrown into these camps. So, just a hell on earth. It was essentially the blind leading the blind in a lot of cases. The third type of work you would be doing is forced contract work. Now, forced contract work at the time was very, very loose and defined, but essentially this would go down to education and medical experimentation. You'd be informing American military intelligence officers about Japanese culture, language, areas used to live to formulate battle maps and sand charts, or you would simply be used for medical experimentation. This could be anything from different types of diseases and medicinal cures to learning about various diseases common to the regions in the South Pacific, all the way up to forced sterilization. Yeah. This sounding a little Nazi-esque, we certainly did learn very well from our predecessors. We're now going to go into some of the camps that I've actually visited and have been near me. I've had the distinguished pleasure of being able to go to some of the, well, I guess pleasure is the wrong word, the distinguished privilege to go to some of these centers and actually learn from the history and talk to the survivors of these camps. And like I said, Washington's one of the only state in the union, I think, that actually actively teaches about this. So let's talk about some of the areas. Obviously, we talked about relocation centers. The closest one to me would be Portland, Oregon. This was solely designed to get people out of the country. Then we had detention centers. These were mostly in Arizona. These could be anything from isolation centers, where they simply just killed you off in the population and used you for service, all the way to FBI-level prisons. For those of you who don't know, this is essentially what a max security prison used to be. This is like Alcatraz at the time. We then have civilian assembly centers. These are just the straight-up internment camps that people will talk about. That's actually That's kind of the catch-all term for, it's like saying a cell. It's just a catch-all term for what the various camps would be, and they would eventually filter out. But one of them was in Portland, Oregon, that I actually got to go visit. Then there was military centers. This is Fort Lewis, Washington. I've been here. This was for the translation, the communications, and some of the medical experimentations would take place. In fact, there is actually a placard up in Puyallup at their military center, and actually at McNeil Island in Washington, too. That does distinguish this. That recently went up, I think 2 years ago. Another thing too, McNeil Island, where in Washington right now they house a lot of sex offenders and a lot of violent criminals. That actually originally started off as a Japanese FBI prison and internment camp that they then operated into a prison. And you can still go there and do tours and stuff like that there to this day. They don't really talk about it as much as a internment camp as they talk about it as a prison, but I have been there as well. Then we have the Natural Immigration and Investigation Facilities. These were the official centers where people's genealogies and ancestries would be tracked and documented. And this is in Seattle, Washington. This is the big one that a lot of my school used to take students to. This is where they would show you how everything goes. Still there. And in fact, it's actually where I got some of the quotes from the newspapers on the microfiche from that center there. So that's the really big one. That's where a lot of the documentation has survived. And there's been a big push for people to destroy that information and wipe it off the face of the earth. Fortunately, they get a lot of funding from the Holocaust Museum and the Anne Frank Association to keep that information going, but it has been heavily suppressed by educational facilities in Washington because it's seen as kind of a big slight. Reason being is that Washington, while only having 3 or 5 of the total camps at any one time, has pretty much destroyed all but 2 effectively. And we pretty much have the largest stockpile of the information that people use. It's very big for people doing Ancestry.com to actually use our facilities. And Washington had, outside of California, the highest per capita populations in these camps. So where Washington only had a few people, we certainly kept the most people per capita. That's actually why Washington holds on to this so much. California had the most camps, but California is also a really big state, so all things considered. Pretty much, if you were a member of the internment camps, there was a very good chance you at some point in time went through Washington twice. But now let's talk about the aftermath. So these camps, a lot of people did die in them, or died as a direct result of them, either from poor conditions, poor health care. They were not as bad as the Nazi Holocaust camps, but they were pretty much equal level with places like Ubelitz and Treblinka, which are the work camps. Which isn't to say much. That's basically saying, well, at least we didn't turn them into gas chambers. Yeah, but you still were on par with the Nazis. So any text history book you find out that says American internment camps weren't that bad, no, pound for pound, they were pretty much equal with a lot of the Nazi work camps in terms of station and holding, in terms of living space. In 1946, when the camps would release all these people back into the population, there was still a lot of distrust, and a lot of these Japanese nationals would actually try to return back to Japan to try and find their families or their ancestry. They would actually expatriate from America, leaving a lot of their family citizens there, but wanting to be buried in the homeland. And that was kind of a sentiment that happened, and a lot of people were happy to see that happen. Because, of course, the Japanese people were going back home, and they liked that. A lot of them felt a need to go back and rebuild Japan after the devastation of the war effort, and that was another big thing that America liked. So basically, when people left, we gave them a clean slate, and that was used as an excuse to destroy the evidence of what we did. But pretty much in 1964, there would be a huge push by the Niseis and Sanseis, the second and third generation citizens, to re-identify as second and third generation citizens and to demand reparations from the American government for what they had done to their people. This would pretty much be in and out of Congress for years, up until about 1983, when Ronald Reagan would officially put it to his desk, which one of the very few things that President Satan never did that was good. Unfortunately, it would sit on his desk for about 5 years as people dinkered back and forth over how much reparations would be given to the Japanese people. And I'm gonna say that I would love to actually say that Ronald Reagan decided to have his heart grow just enough to give these people money and reparations to provide for what we did to them, but it's Ronald fucking Reagan in the 1980s, so just wait, it gets worse. By 1988, there will be a bill for $1.6 billion approved for the reparations to victims of the internment camps. But there was a big catch. Number one, it was only a flat fee of $20,000, about $43,000 by 2019-2020 standards. So a big chunk of change. The problem is that this was money that was supposed to be given out to direct involvement in the internment camps. So people, not families, only the people that were directly in the internment camps could receive this money. This is not including people that were in military camps. This is not receiving people who had relocated out of America. This is strictly people who had gone to internment camps and had been held there and were still alive to receive it directly. It would be $20,000. $1.6 billion was approved. The problem is only about 82,219 people were around from the original, that were still alive and able to receive the funding from the original 200,000-ish citizens that went into the camp. So almost 2/5 of the people didn't take the money. And of that 82,000, only about some 60,000, a little less than 60,000 people actually were approved to receive the funding. Because in order to prove you were in an internment camp, you needed to we didn't brand you. We didn't do tattoos like the Nazis did. You had a paper, some type of identification card, that you were given prior to going into the camp. You then had papers during your time from the camp, and then you had to be put onto a dossier. So not only did you have to be in the camp, you had to be in the camp for a certain amount of time, and you couldn't be moved to the exportation camp. If you were moved to the exportation camp, you didn't qualify. So, yeah, less than 60,000 people, which was probably like 1/5 of the total people who got that. Now, if you're wondering to yourself, hold on, 60,000 times 20,000 does not equal 1.6 billion. Yeah, because this came out in 1988. A lot of this money actually didn't go anywhere to the Japanese nationals. It actually went to funding the Sandinistas and the Contras. Yeah, Ronald Reagan used giving reparations back to Japanese citizens to hide his war crimes with the Mujahideen in the Middle East and his drug dealing operations with the drug cartels. But remember, Ronald Reagan was a great president. No, he was Satan. He's just Satan. So that about does it for this. Now, there is still a lot of communities that are pushing for the American internment camps to be promoted. In fact, 2016, the National Holocaust Association and the Anne Frank Museum did a huge documentary on it that was actually suppressed in the United States. It didn't have anything besides micro theaters and only very select things. It was actually given an MC-17 rating by the MPAA that documented some of these areas. And here's the thing, too. A lot of history books are trying to write this out of history, mainly because it's a stain on America. It was a time America did something that was just as deplorable as the Nazis, equal to the Nazis in a lot of ways. And the thing is that not a lot of pictures or information was ever kept about these things. Most film wasn't used. Documentation had pictures on it, but those people wouldn't keep those. And a lot of people, upon leaving the camps, would actually burn their paperwork to avoid the horrors of that nation. And unfortunately, during my teaching time with the Seattle School District, I was very unable to get a lot of the people who survived the internment camps to come and talk to my students about it. Most of them were just kind of defeated and so tired of the treatment they had received throughout the years that they just really wanted to let it die. So there is a few books that do exist. Snow Falling on Cedars is probably the most famous one. But there's very few people who actively want to talk about it as compared to the Holocaust, mainly because they see their story being destroyed in history and in textbooks. One of the moments that actually brought me to tears as a teacher, in a bad way, not in a good way, was that I had a student who was Chinese who had family who came over. They could track their ancestry back to the American Railroad. Their parents had been stuck into the American concentration camps, the internment camps, and they never were allowed to receive their funding because they were actually exported back to China, more specifically Hong Kong, where, of course, her father would receive a college education and would actually move back to America to teach at the Seattle University. So this girl's family had literally run the gauntlet, and yet in her history books we never talked about that. And I begged her family to give me copies of some of the documents for educational purposes, and they just kind of decided no, they didn't want to do that. And that's totally their understanding. I have no right to demand it of them. I respect their decision entirely, and I hope that they go forward. Telling other people the story, I don't demand that I have access to their information, but I really, really wish I would have. So that kind of wraps it up for today for our video. I wanted to do this video specifically because when I was doing my other video on how the historical hatred of Asian nationals by Americans, I didn't bring up the Japanese internment camps because I really wanted to dedicate a very specific video to the American Holocaust, essentially. One of the many American Holocausts, certainly the most recent one. Well, situation down the border is pretty Holocausty, if you ask me. I hope this was educational for you all. And to all of my Asian citizens and viewers out there who watch these videos or know about these videos, I just want to say that what happened to you was completely unethical. It was not keeping with any view of American values, and that I, foremost, would like to apologize for my ancestors and my people's actions in the keeping of these camps. And hopefully, by me making these videos and bringing your suffering into the light and keeping the history accurate, we have done something to try and keep the horrors that your families experience alive for future generations to learn from. That's all I have, guys. Have a great day.